Okay. So I just started showing my screen. Is everyone able to see my screen? Cool, perfect. So let's get started. So first I'll go through what's expected in Module Five's homework. So this week this module rather, it's 2 weeks. There will be there's a couple of there's three parts, and you guys will be doing at least two of these three parts. So parts one and two are so part one is and they're sort of in increasing order of difficulty. So more beginner, sort of beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So part one, where it's basically, and also with all of these assignments, like this assignment five is more meant to focus on the basics of JavaScript. So there's not even much visualization per se. It's more about sort of just getting a handle on using HTML and JavaScript for those who would want to use tools like D3 or other JavaScript-based tools for their final projects. And just to also highlight the goal of this section of the course. So with the rest of the course, we're going to be focusing on JavaScript and then your final projects, which you have some leeway in terms of what you're using. But basically obviously we're not like the expectation isn't that you would be a web developer at the end of learning this. But what I am hoping is that you would be able to know enough JavaScript where you would be able to sort of pick up a JavaScript visualization package, something like D3 if you're building more complex graphs, things like Vega Lite or Plotly, or things like Mapbox or Leaflet or Carto if you're doing more mapping, sort of more geographic visualization. So hopefully this sort of background it'll give you enough to be able to sort of read in a CSV, do and sort of use JavaScript to implement these existing packages. So be it something like Leaflet if you're doing geographic stuff, D3 or Plotly.js or Vega Lite if you're using more classical visualization packages. So for part one of the homework, you'll be just creating a few sample functions here. So in this case, one that reverses any word that is typed in. So it accepts either an input or alert box and prints the reversed word. And then we're also writing a function that takes an input number and prints a table with the first 20 multiples of that number. You could you could see highlighted here, like you're pretty much taking a number, performing the necessary multiplication, and essentially formatting it as a table like so. And then for part two, part two gets a bit deeper into D3. So what you'll actually be doing is linking to a data set. In this case, there's a presidents.csv, which we'll look at over here. So in presidents.csv, you just simply have the name, height, and weight of a bunch of presidents. And you'll simply be displaying that data in a table, as well as as well as writing a function that allows users to look up presidential height and weight. And then lastly, the part 3 is meant to build on top of module 4.3, where you'll be using the Flask API to, and I left this purposefully pretty vague. So essentially, whereas with module 4.5 we were creating a Flask API using we were creating a Flask API using the Socrata data. In this homework, we'll be displaying something based on that API, and hopefully, by going through these examples, you'll see, what how Flask could be used in conjunction with JavaScript, and how actually using Flask in conjunction with JavaScript lets you avoid a lot of the headaches of doing more complex data calculations in JavaScript. So, any other questions before I dive into these examples? Cool. And just put it in the chat when if you do have any questions. So let's look at the first example. We'll open up that. So these examples, you'll see, except for the Flask, where you'll see a Flask server. These examples are, you'll see an HTML file and a JavaScript file, and some other, data files associated with it. And the best way to run these is to run like Python comes with HTTP servers. So there's this simple HTTP server. There's also this module called http.server, which I just find easier to remember. And when I run that, it just it just serves up, wherever the files, wherever you run it. So when I'm in the Hello World folder, so I'm right here. And when I run this and go to my local host, and again, you just check the port right here, you'll see a listing of files. If I had named this index.html, I would be seeing that page, but because this is named something else, it's not, this sort of root directory is just simply showing the files that I have. So it's, functioning just as a file explorer here. And now when I go into HTML, I see, I see some things in a page. So let's see how I ended up adding that. So this first example is just showing some of the, basics of what you're able to do with JavaScript. So we have, so basically, and so for you two on the call, what experience do you guys have with HTML and JavaScript? And it's totally fine if there's, sort of, none. So cool. Yeah, so HTML, it's so yeah, a lot of, HTML is just, you'll see that in so many places. So it's definitely out there. And Albina, if as you're working on this assignment, if there's like, don't hesitate to email me if you're having any issues, because having experience with HTML, that's not one of the prerequisites. So this is, really meant to, like, as to try to get people from zero to at least getting themselves into trouble with JavaScript. But the So basically, HTML is you just have these tags surrounded by brackets, and you have different tags referring to different types of different things. So the actual HTML tag, like that's your sort of largest scale. You have your HT, like this is actually corresponding to this close here. So the entire document is within the HTML tag. HTML documents, they have both a head and a body. So here, the head, we're just showing a title, and in the body, that's where we have the meat of the of the page here. And you'll see things like and all of these tags, just um, you could Google what all of these tags mean, but you have things like headers, so H1, H2 through H6, those are headers, and I'll get into script in a bit, but just to highlight a few other tags, you have things like here, for example, you have a P, which stands for paragraph. So that's a nice way to sort of get your, sort of paragraph form, sort of formatting. And this BR tag means break, and that's a singular tag. So if I do something like this, this BR doesn't have a closing tag, but that's a break. So what would actually show up is something like this, with that break just serving as a line break. So we have, so those are some basic tags, and then just one other, and within the other tags, I'll highlight some useful tags. But one other thing I just want to highlight here is this form element. So the form element is basically what's happening here. So so part of what's in this app is I have this interactivity here where I let users enter in a number, and the app is, and this, using JavaScript, we're going to check if the number is even or odd, and is it divisible by 3. So if I enter in the number 7, you'll see it correctly says it's odd and it's not divisible by 3. And then if I say 9, that is divisible by 3. So so that's what's happening with the tags, and I'll get into, I'll try to highlight as much as possible those tag types. And one other thing to mention is when you're using sort of writing HTML and JavaScript, the browser itself can essentially be used to debug and to like help you in the development process. So if I right click or double click, depending on, or two finger click, depending on whether you're using Mac or Windows, and click on inspect, you get what are called the dev tools. And what these, and I'm not going to go through everything here. The only two that I'm really going to focus on is this elements tag, this elements section, and the console. So the elements, what this shows is the page as it currently exists. So, and I'll get into this once we, continue talking about JavaScript, but I have, things that are predefined using HTML. But I also have some things, I'm just using this document.write to inject some HTML using JavaScript. And using JavaScript, like, right now this is just plain text, but as you get further down here, you'll see that you're able to. So where is it? Right here. I'm essentially just adding 5 and 5 together, and I'm sort of using that information to write to the document. But within the document, like what I see in this elements is essentially what's been written to the document. So something like this, 5 plus 5 equals 10, that's being written right here. And so you see like it's, it's using JavaScript to add these two numbers together to write the result to the, sort of with some string formatting, write the result to the page. But when I look in elements here, I see essentially the result. So when I go into this here, I see, and actually, with this document.write, I didn't even add any tags, so you're just seeing the text of 5 plus 5 equals 10. So we're adding, so, basically this shows you, in Elements, you're seeing essentially the page as it's currently rendered. So within, so there's also these script tags. Within the script tags, you could include JavaScript directly in the HTML file. But most of the time, what you would be doing is something like this. So here you could see, I'm sorry, this here. So here you could see I'm using this source. So within the tags, these like this type, size, these are called attributes. That's just some terminology there. So I'm using the source attribute to essentially bring in another JavaScript file. So I'm bringing in, so usually that's how you would design your projects. You would have JavaScript files being brought in to your HTML so that you're keeping that separate. This is more for explanatory purposes, showing what script tags do. So script tags, you define what type it is, in this case JavaScript, and it's just running the script within them. And and basically, these scripts are what's allowing us to essentially, add a lot of these more sophisticated elements. So here we generated a random number. We did that using this here, math.random. The math library is a JavaScript library which just includes a few mathematical functions. One thing about JavaScript is, and you'll notice this in some of the more complex examples, that it's pretty low level when it comes to working with data. And it's, so you'll, things that in Pandas or in R data frames you're able to do very quickly and painlessly. In JavaScript, it will seem very hard to do. There's no concept of a data frame in JavaScript, so you're dealing with things like arrays. So the Python version, a dictionary in Python is called JSON in JavaScript. So objects like this. Something like sort of objects like this that are similar to dictionaries in Python. These come in handy in JavaScript, and these are the sorts of objects that you'll be dealing with. So, but keep that in mind when you see the more complex data operations happening. And one more thing to note is when you're like here, you could see I'm actually defining these numbers as strings. So I have, two quotes surrounding it there. And this plus sign here is how I'm turning that back into a number. And I'll actually use this as an excuse to go into the console here. We were talking about the elements here. We also have a console, and this is, it pretty much just lets you test out JavaScript, and it's very useful when you're debugging. And also, if I had any errors in my page, this is where where those errors would come up. So if I try something like, and actually one other thing just to mention about JavaScript is when you are defining variables, you're using this this keyword here, var. So you need to, you can't, you technically can. I actually don't know what the default is if I just say this, something like that. But what you're supposed to do is write var a equals, something like this, 5. And JavaScript also uses semicolons. So there we have a string. And if I do that, you'll see that it's now a number. So if I said it's appending something to it like a string, whereas if I do, I get, what it looks like if these were numbers. And this is important because as we get into D3 examples, they'll be, the data is brought in by default as string. So you'll notice that these plus signs get used a lot to make sure that you're, that you're actually getting the numbers behind the data. So we have that, and then we have, so basically, just to quickly go through what's happening here, we have our input, so this form input here. We have an input that is here, this type is number. So you could see with a number input, you have these little arrows here, and it's expecting a number. And then we have this input type, which is a button. So that's this check button here. So the value of it is check. And the most important thing about the button is it has this on-click attribute. And you'll see this on-click attribute, we're essentially giving it some JavaScript to run. In this case, it's a calc function. And I won't go through the full code of what is happening here, but just suffice it to say that this function is essentially setting whether the is telling us whether a number is divisible by 3 or and whether it's even or odd. And we're using like similar to Python and R, this percent is modulo. So we're using remainders to test whether it's divisible by 3 or even or odd. So we run this function, we get a string saying that, is the number even or odd? Is the number divisible by 3? And we're returning that string. And then more importantly, what's happening with the calc function is I'm using this function here. So what this is doing is I'm using get element by ID and then sort of referencing the ID of whichever element I want to grab. So if I, using sort of showing what happens with something like that. If I wanted, if I wanted to grab a div, So let's say this div ID equals target. I could say something like that. And you could see it knows that I'm referring to that div. So I define that as a variable t. And then I'm using this inner HTML. And all that means is, if I have something like this, this hello is considered the inner HTML. And it could get pretty sophisticated because you could have things nested within each other. You could have something like, something like this to represent, sort of nested HTML, and these levels could get pretty sophisticated pretty quickly. So you set your inner HTML to this function, and that's just simply returning that string, and that is how something like this is getting returned when I enter in a number. So any questions on that so far before I delve into the other examples? Cool. So for D3, one thing I want to highlight is I posted this in the content, but this book, Interactive Data Visualization for the Web, I recommend this as a nice reference to get up to speed with D3. And I like, it's, I don't want to, sort of have you guys thinking of this in terms of like, assigned chapters, but, more use this as a reference as you're working your way around D3. And some things I would focus on. So the first 5 chapters are really what, sets the groundwork for working with D3. And chapter 5 in particular is what what really like gets to the heart of what makes D3 so powerful. So what I would recommend is start like sort of like skim the first couple of chapters, like just get an idea of what they're about so that you could refer to them as needed. But chapter 5 is really what what shows what D3 is capable of. And this example, hello D3. So let's get into this. Start our server. And so this example is built off of the example that is essentially sort of built slowly in this chapter. So I recommend at least reading the first half of chapter 5 and see how things see how essentially you're able to bind the data that you're bringing in to, or bind some data set to elements on the page. And so what are we looking at here? So this is something very simple. We're just displaying a bunch of numbers, but the most important thing here is these numbers correspond to a data set. So we have a data set, in this case, just an array, and this is somehow giving us this. So first, let's see what we started out with. And there's not much here. We only have some things in the head and the body. This meta charset, that's necessary for Plotly for some, I believe it's a Unicode thing. So don't worry about what that does. Just add that to your head. And we just have our body. And within the body, we just have our script tag. And so what exactly is happening here? So the first, and D3, it operates, you'll see these sorts of chained functions a lot in D3. So let's see what exactly it's doing. So this, so we're selecting, well actually, and first, let's do this. Let's inspect the page and see what we have here. So we have our body, and we have a bunch of P elements with numbers written in them. So again, you don't see in elements, you don't see how we ended up with this. You just see sort of the final rendering. So all we know from looking at the elements is we ended up with a bunch of these P elements with these data points. And how did we get that? So we run this d3.select body. So we're selecting the body here. We are, this function here, select all. This is meant to work with elements that don't exist yet. So we started out with just the body, and we, there are no P elements yet, but this is necessary to, to sort of run this. We're binding all the P elements. This is what this step is called, the data and enter. This is binding the data to these P elements that don't yet exist. And then we use append to append the P elements, and then this .text element to return the inner text. And one thing to note here is within the text we have this this what's called an anonymous function, and just to sort of show why something like this is useful, I'm returning d+5, so it's I'm sort of, for every d I'm just returning d+5. The original data set is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and that's how I'm ending up with my count starting at 10. So so that's what's happening there. If I were to do something like this, and I restart my server, you'll notice that the text it's adding is called hello, and you should see this goes, and this I forget where exactly it's bound, how exactly this book introduced it, but basically with it, sort of reading through the first section of chapter 5, you'll see how essentially, even though it's just showing hello, the data is already bound to the to those elements. So I'm not using it, but it's there. I just don't want to save that. Okay, so I have my, so that's what's happening with D3 there, and the and what I recommend is reading, finding, like this is an O'Reilly book, so if you just Google the title, you'll be able to find it out there, and it's and so you'll be able to use this as as sort of a reference to get up to speed with D3. So for our next example, we'll be able to see why why it's a bit of a pain to use JavaScript. So in this case, I'm using Plotly, and I'm using Plotly.js here. So let's run our simple server. And first, let's see. So the app, this is building on top of the Shiny and the Flask examples that I had. But all this is doing is it's a simple dropdown, and it lets users pick cities and view data based on those cities. In this case, housing price indices. So how am I doing that? So first, to point out like some documentation, Plotly/JavaScript. This is the best place to go for sort of building Plotly graphs, and Plotly itself is built on top of D3, and I purposefully am exposing a lot of the sort of D3 within this function, within this script. And so these will show you examples of chart types, and then this function reference is essentially how to use Plotly within JavaScript. So keep this in mind as we're going through this example. So what are we doing here? So first, we have this plotly.d and also like plotly.d3, that's the same as d3. So consider this d3.csv. So we're bringing in a CSV file. You could see we have this function here. So we have some anonymous function based on rows. Now, your first question looking at something like this should be, what do these rows look like? What exactly is this d3.csv function giving me? So let's find out what it is giving us. So all I did, and console log, that's the same as print in Python. And it's your friend when you're doing troubleshooting like this, because it lets you see things on the console and helps you in debugging where you might have gone wrong with your JavaScript. So let's reserve this. There we are. And so we have this complex looking, this stuff here, and so this is an array. You could see kind of the array-like structure. You have the brackets, the square brackets, and then the curly brackets within. These curly brackets are JSON. So this is just a list of these JSON objects, and you're able to inspect objects using this sort of arrow-like sort of explorer here. And so what is it giving us? It's giving us essentially an array, and for that array, it's giving us essentially each of the sort of columns of the data set. So looking at what the data looks like, we have our date, seasonality, metro, tier, and housing price index. And we have that same thing coming in with each row. So rows is essentially giving us each one of those. Now you'll see a few things that I'm doing using JavaScript here. So first, what I wanted is, and actually let's pull up index.html. So what do I have pre-populated? I have just a div that is ID'd as graph. So as you could guess, my graph is going to go there. And I also have this right here. I have an empty select tag. Now the select tag is just referring to this drop down here. And so as I mentioned, it's empty. So we haven't defined anything, what the options within the select are going to be. But you'll see what that looks like by inspecting the page. So let's see what it came up with. So we have this div here. We have our select ID. And you could see we have these tags that look like this. So you have, they're called options. They and they have this attribute called value, and then the text. So what this means is the value is what's actually being accessed whenever you're choosing something from the dropdown, and that could be different from what's being displayed. So as an example, if rather than using Metro names, we were using Metro codes, our data were coded in some way, I could set the value to be the code and have the text be more user-friendly so that users are seeing the Metro names, they're not seeing random codes. So you have these option values set over here. And so how did I populate that? I did that in a couple steps. So first, I just I needed to get a list of unique metros. So basically, with JavaScript, similar to Python and R, you have different ways of writing loops. Your sort of standard for loop, it doesn't work the same way as in Python or R, so sort of for item in if you have something like this, like you're actually iterating through each of those values in Python. But in JavaScript, you're actually you're only able to iterate through index numbers. So a for loop is essentially so if you had some array named array, this is how you would access the individual members. And also, what would be more useful here is if I access the length of that array. So this is really how you would loop through that array. So JavaScript's a bit more lower level than something like R or Python. But this for each loop is a bit smarter. It's actually taking the array and iterating over it in a more sort of Python or R style. So these are going to be your friends as well. But it's still kind of low level what I'm doing. I'm just iterating through each of the rows. I'm checking if the this metros includes or not metros includes. So I'm seeing like if the metro that I'm on isn't in the array, I'm going to use this metros.push, which just simply it's the same as .append in Python, just adding a new element to an array, and I'm sort of building out my array in that way. So, it's kind of a pain to have to do something like this. We're used to, in R and Python, we're used to being able to deal with, just use .unique to get all of the unique values. So, this is hassle to have to do these sorts of calculations within JavaScript. But we have our, as a result of this, we have our metro list. And I'm using this here to add the options to select. So it's very similar to what I was doing before. I'm doing this dot select metro selector. This pound sign, that means ID. So I'm selecting. So like previously using D3, I just selected the body. So it selected the body tag. Here I'm selecting the, it doesn't matter what the tag is, but what matters is its ID is metro selector. And indeed, that is what we have here. We have this select ID equals metro selector. Otherwise, it's very similar to what I was doing in the previous D3 example, with this as our as sort of something additional. And if you remember, the like this here is called an attribute. So that's accessed in D3 using this dot attr. And so I'm selecting the value attribute. So value equals, I'm selecting that. And once again, it's an anonymous function. I'm just returning D. But I could return, some other function based on some other, some calculation based on that D. And I have, so, that's how I'm adding to the selector. I have I have this function here that is creating a graph given a metro area. And as you read through this, you'll see it's also being done in a pretty low level way. I have, these sort of arrays that I'm building here, dates, high, middle, and low. I'm iterating through each of the rows. I'm making sure it's matching, like the seasonality is always going to be seasonal and seasonally adjusted in this case, but I'm checking if the metro is equal to that metro. If it is, I go through this logic here. So I'm adding to, depending on whether it's high, middle, or low. So this is pretty similar to, this is like a manual way of, essentially doing something like reshape in R or like pivot in Pandas. Once I do that, I just build my Plotly object. I'm again using a for each loop just to create my array, and I return the figure. So then, like here, I'm using this document.getElementById again to access the graph div. And so here, like I'm plotting an initial graph. So I'm using this function called plotly.newplot. And what that's doing is it's taking the, so if I go back here, this goes, this is a nice reference for the functions, but plotly new plot draws a new plot within a div element. So all I'm doing is I'm giving it a graph, I'm giving it a figure, because remember, I'm returning the figure from that function. In this case, Atlanta, that's the first metro there. So that's how the initial graph is built. And then the last thing that's being done here is adding an event listener, what's called an event listener, to the to my app here. So essentially what I'm doing is, I have a drop down here. And what I'm saying is whenever there's a change here, tell me what the new value is and return a graph based on that new value. So I'm using d3.select to select the div in the object in the tag in question. So here, this metro selector is referring to the select object here. And what I'm saying with this dot on is saying whenever there's a change, you're going to run this function. And this plotly.react, you'll see that defined over here, but plotly.react is basically if a plot is already existing, it's an efficient way to essentially change that plot. And there are more targeted ways to change it. You'll see things like restyle, and I would read through these functions. But what I'm doing is I'm essentially defining my fig, and the key is this here. So d3.event.target.value is the actual, essentially that's the value that's coming out of the drop down. So when I select Seattle, this value is going to be the string Seattle. And so what I'm doing is once this changes, get what the new value is and run this function, this plotly.react mygraph fig. So any questions before I go into the last example? Okay, cool. So hopefully, one of the things that you should be seeing in this JavaScript example is, JavaScript is a low-level language. It's not the best for data processing. So what I added with this Flask example is essentially a way to move the data processing back to Python. So let's see what this app looks like. So this is a Flask app. So I'm going to run this HPI API. And just like with Dash, I have a Flask app running. So it's running my server. Cool. So here it's exactly the same as that last app. The only thing I changed was I added an extra drop down here for seasonality. Now let's see what's happening with this app. So there's a few things going on here. So here's our main app. And I have a few different types of APIs defined. So this, so here, this API, this is serving the, and actually, I should change this. So this is actually returning the Plotly graph objects themselves. So if you remember in this example, we were building our Plotly graphs with this, create graph here. I'm actually building the Plotly graph within Python, rather than in JavaScript. So and that means I get to do all of my data manipulation within Python, and on the JavaScript side, all I need to do is retrieve the figure. So what does this look like? So I have my main app here, and then if I go to seasonality and metro, let's go there. I end up with a JSON. So here you could see I have this is a Plotly object. So I have a data tag. I have my layout. My layout tag, and it's done all of the hard work for me within Python, where it's easier to deal with data. So within Python, I'm just using pandas to read in the CSV. I'm doing my, I'm using pandas pivot. I don't have to worry about, writing for loops and building arrays from scratch. I have, yeah, so I'm basically, pretty easily able to, manipulate data. It's easier to build my Plotly object within Python than to, sort of deal with the data within JavaScript. I also have this API here, so this HPI /values. And what this is meant to do is return the unique, so I'm just using the unique values with .unique from pandas, getting unique seasonality and unique metros. So if you remember in the D3 example, in the Plotly example, I had to iterate through the rows an extra time in order to get this information. Now I don't. So I have those values coming in. I have this stuff going on in terms of the sort of serving. So this render template, that's just giving us the index.html here. And similar with JavaScript, and especially with Flask, like don't get, don't get too worried if, you feel like you're using, Flask a bit more superficially, because, really, like, this is what I'm trying to, expose. The reason why I'm trying to expose everyone to Flask is because I want, people to be able to offload their data operations to Python, rather than doing it within JavaScript if they choose to use JavaScript for their final projects. So, so things like, render template, or, why am I using JSONify here? There's like, don't worry about like sort of using the examples that I'm providing as kind of boilerplates and, building on top of them. Hopefully, with these examples, there's enough variation where, you would be able to essentially use it for your purposes. But mainly I wanted to focus on sort of these first two APIs here. So we have those APIs, and then we have our JavaScript. So we're doing the same thing, adding the metros, but you could see we, with this D3, I'm using d3.json first of all. I'm bringing in, I'm reading in HPI /values, and I'm getting those as my defaults. So that this has this comes pre-calculated. I don't have to worry about looping through and getting those values. Similarly for defaults.seasonality. Then what I'm doing is I'm reading in, I'm doing this for the initial graph, so I'm sort of just getting the first value of those defaults and building a new plot based off of the those defaults. So you could see here I'm using this API here. I have seasonality and metro, and here I have seasonality and metro. And then it's very, and then it it's very similar to the logic that we were using with Hello Plotly.js. So we have these these sort of selecting the selector and then the metro selector and then adding an event listener. The only thing that I want to add here is I'm bringing in this object here. So what I did here is define, got my selectors from the document. So document.getElement by ID, metro selector, and seasonality selector. And this is essentially how, from one event listener, I'm able to access the value from another selector. Now, what does that mean? That means that if I go back to the app and I make a selection, what's technically happening is it's getting this Phoenix value, but it's also checking what what's defined here in seasonality. Same thing if I make a different selection for seasonality, and it still knows that I'm looking at Phoenix at this point. So what I'm doing here is for the metro selector, I'm accessing the seasonality selector. And then for the seasonality selector, I'm accessing the metro selector. And then within each of these functions, I have this plotly this d3.json call using the seasonality and the target value. So that, again, you remember last time we were using d3.event.target.value. And so that is it for the examples that I had prepared for everyone. And yeah, Albina, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, I just saw these questions now. So Albina was asking, how do you run these files? So this is what I've been doing in the terminal here. So if something is just JavaScript, so you could see here, I just have the HTML file and the JavaScript file. I run that by doing this python-m http.server or simple HTTP server. And you'll also see that outlined in the book here. I believe, yeah. So this shows you how to run a server, and so that's where the JavaScript is ran. And then if you have a Flask app, that's just running the Python file. So there we are. So here it's just Python hpi.py, and everything is included there. So do we have any other questions? Yep. Albina asked if these examples are available. Yeah, I just pushed them yesterday, so they haven't been up there for long. But if you go to the course GitHub page, you'll see all these examples there. And for the purpose, just to reiterate, the sorts of I mean, like, don't be afraid to use these as templates, and really kind of like, I think they're sort of worked out in such a way that it should you should be able to sort of use these as a guide for if you choose to use JavaScript for your final project. And just to also reiterate, like, in just these few weeks, we're not expecting like, I'm not expecting um, everyone to be web development experts. Really, like, this is just about um, you know these like libraries like D3, and a lot of other visualization packages out there. They're written in JavaScript, so it's helpful to at least get some fundamentals, and then really essentially know how to use those packages. So it's definitely all new. It's very different from what you previously would be working with in R and Python. For your final project, you do still have the option of using Shiny and Flask and Dash. So if if you choose to use those, there's no problem with that. But this is just sort of trying to give you guys the opportunity to use these potentially more powerful but harder to use and further away from the sort of data science core skill set. Use these packages that are out there. So with that, we went a bit over. So unless anyone has any other questions, um, I'll leave you guys for the night. So the proposals, those should be back tomorrow. I'll get those back. They'll usually, like, the feedback I provide, it's going to be specifically targeted for assignment 6. So stay tuned for that. And I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.